Alrighty, everybody. It is December. It's December already. It is the end of the year. I can't believe it. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. Okay, so last time we joined our heroes, we were talking about how will you know what CMMC solicitation you need, who decides the level of CMMC that goes in a solicitation, and how do they decide? So the next logical question from there is, how is it going to play out? What is it going to look like? What is this phased rollout that everybody's talking about? There's phases, there's 4 phases, but it goes over 7 years and blah, blah, blah. So once they've made these decisions about the CMMC level, how will this thing roll out? That's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions as to, what is going to apply to me and when is it going to apply to me? And, I think a lot of people are putting money in the bank hoping that there's a self-assessment in their future, or a part of the phase rollout doesn't hit them within the first wave or second wave of contracts, and they get that extra time. So I think it's really, important that we cover this, especially with the timing. I think that we're right around the corner from 48 CFR. Seeing it, I think that we are on the prefaces. Actually, we are at the airing of this show less than a couple weeks away from the effective date of the 32 CFR rule, and things are going to start moving even faster than they already are. So I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, it's another factor. There's 2 different rules at play, and one goes into effect while the other one is still waiting for the final rule to be published. How does that work? Blah, blah, blah. We're going to get into all of it. Okay, so let's just cover the basics. If you want more details and more context around the information that we're talking about in this episode, check out the link to our full 32 CFR final rule webinar, where we went through all of the details, in detail. So today we're just talking about phased rollout stuff. Okay, top level idea here. CMMC is going to affect all defense contractors and subcontractors in some way. Really, the only way you won't be touched by the long arm of CMMC at some level is if you are below the micro purchase threshold of $10,000 in your award, or you are purely a commercial off-the-shelf product, which is an actual definition, an actual legal definition. Maybe we'll cover that in a future episode, but a lot of people believe they're COTS. They're not actually COTS, but those are the only 2 ways that you can get out of the obligation to protect DoD's covered information in the course of your contracts or subcontracts with them, below the micro purchase threshold or purely for COTS. So table 5 in the 32 CFR final rule breaks down the number of companies in the DIB by DoD's estimate of what assessment level they will need. And they do this by small business and what they call other than small business. So small business and big business, essentially. So 63% of the DIB, this 220, 300,000-ish number that you often hear, 63% of companies, the DoD estimates, will just be at level 1. Most companies in the DIB don't handle CUI, and so most companies won't need level 2 requirements and beyond. For level 2, which is when you are handling CUI and you need to implement NIST SP 800-171 pursuant to DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7012, 37% of companies in the DIB will be at CMMC level 2, but only 2%, the DoD estimates, will be at level 2 self-assessment. This should already cause doubt in your mind if you have convinced yourselves that you will be getting a level 2 self-assessment. Very, very few companies in the DoD's estimate will be at level 2 before we get into any of the factors behind why particular solicitations receive the CMMC status level requirements they do, which is what we talked about last week. So make sure you check out that episode. And then only 1% of the DIB is estimated to need CMMC level 3 requirements. That's a whole other can of worms. Jason, this is your wheelhouse. It's expensive, it's big, it's complicated. It's a huge jump above level 2. However, very, very few, less than 1,500 total companies, according to the DoD, will need CMMC level 3. So really, we're talking about CMMC level 2 here, because level 1 is just a self-assessment. Most people won't need self-assessment at level 2. They're going to need external certification. So how is this going to roll out? What is the timeline going to look like for when this shows up in contracts after people have made the decision that a given requirement ought to be in a solicitation in a contract.
So I look at this table and I immediately think of the Lion King. And you know the scene in the Lion King when Mufasa is holding up Simba or standing next to Simba and they're looking at the Pride Land and it's all illuminated. And he goes, "This is our kingdom." And then you look over to the dark area. "Don't go there. That's not the kingdom." But the
The
kingdom
elephant boneyard, you're never
that
supposed to
still
go there.
exists. But what this doesn't portray is the elephant boneyard, right? Like if that's how we want to describe it, that outside outlier area, this is just the companies that the DoD has direct contracts with, direct interaction with, not subcontractors, not tertiary contractors. So looking at this, sometimes in your mind, you want to say this may be double or triple what it actually is or what it's going to be, just because the level of the branches of the supply chain and how deep it actually goes.
Yeah, the DoD can only estimate the total impact and the rollout based off the companies that it can see. And the DoD really can't see past the primes, maybe the tier one subcontractors some of the time. They just don't have that information. They don't have privity on those subcontracts, so they can't include them in the estimate, which is why these are the numbers that we have to go on. But let's just talk about this total breakdown here of how it will roll out. So we talked about the criteria that will be used to determine what the level in a solicitation will be, but when will it be? When will this happen? So according to the final rule, the implementation period is going to be conducted in phases. So this will show up in contracts and solicitation in phases, and it will have 4 phases, phases 1 through 4. And these phases, according to the DoD, are intended to really do 3 things. They're intended to address any CMMC assessment ramp-up issues, like assessment capacity, number of assessors, so on and so forth. It's also supposed to provide the time needed to train the necessary number of assessors and to allow companies time to understand and implement CMMC requirements. So the further you dig into this phased rollout, the more you realize the DoD has created this phased rollout as essentially a concession to industry, that the entire reason why they're doing CMMC is because companies haven't implemented their requirements. The entire reason why they're doing a phased rollout is so that companies have time to comply with the requirements that DoD knows they haven't implemented. So, it's sort of an open secret here. We need time to build up the assessors and assessment capacity. The entire reason we're doing this is to verify that you've done it, and we know you haven't, which is why we're sort of slow rolling this out over the course of several phases. All right, so let's talk about the structure of this phase rollout. What are the phases going to look like? What do they mean? When do we think that they're going to happen? So the important part to know here, just like we've talked about before, there are 2 rules that fully implement CMMC. There is the 32 CFR CMMC rule, which describes the CMMC program policy, the levels, the roles and responsibilities, the waivers, the scoring, so on and so forth, all the policy stuff that governs CMMC as a program. There's another rule, the 48 CFR rule, which is the language that will actually show up in your contract solicitations and clauses that implements the CMMC policy in DoD contracts. 2 different regulations, because policy is one regulation, contract clauses are their own regulations, which means 2 different rules, which means 2 different rulemaking timelines, which means there's a couple of ideas to sort of hold in your head at the same time here. So the 32 CFR CMMC final rule will go into effect on December 16th, not very long from now. And that means that the CMMC program, for all intents and purposes, is live. The rule is live. The regulation is live. It is on the books. It is in effect. It is good to go, which means that CMMC assessments are commercially available for anyone who wants them. Everybody who had a qualifying joint surveillance assessment and a qualifying score will automatically be CMMC certified. Everyone who's in line for a C3PO assessment that then completes their assessment successfully, CMMC certified. And we're rolling down the runway with CMMC here. However, it won't actually be a requirement in DoD contracts until the contract clause rule is done. And that's a different rule than the one that goes into effect on December 16th. So DoD's phased rollout and their yearly assessment estimates and all that stuff are based on the 48 CFR final rule timeline rather than the 32 CFR final rule. So based off what we know about the 48 CFR rulemaking timeline, and based off of some things that are said in blogs from the Small Business Administration and what DoD has said in interviews around the rulemaking process, we estimate that the 48 CFR rule will be final as early as March of 2025. It could be as late as June-ish of 2025. So let's just say it's Q2. Let's just call it Q2 of 2025. That's phase one of the CMMC phase rollout, Q2 of 2025. Every phase thereafter, phase two, phase three, phase four, happens one calendar year later. So phase one will be Q2 of 2025. Phase two will be Q2 of 2026. Phase three will be Q2 of 2027. Phase four will be Q2 of 2028. But what do the phases mean, right? Do I have until 2028 in order to delay my implementation and slowly start chipping away? This is where it's important to read the details in the rule. So in phase one, this begins on the effective date of the 48 CFR CMMC final rule. This will be level 1 and level 2 self-assessment requirements included in all applicable solicitations and contracts as a condition of contract award. When you hear that, you think, oh, that first year is just self-assessments. And as we talked about last week, the criteria that determines whether or not a solicitation will require a certification or self-assessment, level 2 or level 1, is not dictated by the phased rollout plan. It's dictated by criticality, threat, the nature of the technology, the nature of the data, other things than this idea of a phased rollout. And when you read at the bottom, they say that DoD has discretion prior to the effective date to include requirements, and they have discretion to include level 2 certification assessments, third-party C3PAO assessments in place of self-assessment, right? So the DoD discretion X factor here is the part to pay attention to. There is no guarantee that during phase one of the phased rollout that it will just be self-assessment. There's a very good chance that there will be level 2 certification assessments, which is why the primes are pushing their suppliers to do that. It's why you have this DoD discretion carve out in the language when you look at the criteria they use to select which requirement will go into solicitations. There is zero indication that you have an extra year from the 48 CFR effective date to just be doing self-assessments.
No, so I think that what this phase rollout represents is 4 separate deadlines. 4 deadlines for organizations to be prepared before they have to pay the piper, right? So before they have to show the justification that they have implemented the requirements associated with CMMC. And so for each one of these, it's like we said it in the beach body of evidence episode, but you don't start working on the beach body June 1st to go to the beach June 2nd and expect to be in the situation that you want to be in. And essentially looking at these deadlines as the time to wait for implementation is the equivalent in CMMC language as doing that. The time is to start now because you want to be prepared to demonstrate that you have the certification, the self-assessment, whatever it may be, as a part of that rollout at the time that it appears in the contracts. Because as we've discussed before, Jacob, that timeline from when the contract is bid on and awarded is getting shorter and shorter by the minute. And that's
yeah, absolutely. So directly out of the 32 CFR final rule, there's a line that says during the first phase of the implementation plan, during the first phase of the phased rollout, a majority of CMMC requirements will be for self-assessment. A majority, not all of them, right? Not all of them. And this is the problem, is that if even one of them requires a C3PAO third-party assessment and you're a subcontractor downstream, then any CUI that gets flowed to you in accordance with that contract triggers your requirement to have a CMMC third-party assessment, regardless of what the phased rollout happens to be. So let's talk about the other phases here, because the further into the phases you get, the less it matters. So phase one is this majority self-assessment, but massive amounts of DoD discretion, plus the issue of level 2 C3PAO lock-in that we've talked about before. 1 calendar year later, which we estimate to be Q2 of 2026, we're in phase 2. This is where CMMC level 2 certification assessments go into all applicable solicitations and contracts as a condition of award. So even if some of the awards and offers that go into phase 1 are for self-assessment, by the time you get to Q2 of 2026, all of them are going to be external assessments that are applicable, right? So there's really not a lot of time between now, let alone March Q2 of 2025 and Q2 of 2026, when there is no, is it going to be a self-assessment? Is it going to be external assessment plus the discretion on top of that? Phase 3, we estimate, would start in Q2 of 2027. So this is when CMMC level 2 certification is in all applicable contracts and solicitations. It's also in all option periods. This is when CMMC level 3 certification starts to come into the equation. And then by the time you get to phase 4 in Q2 of 2028, all applicable levels, all applicable types of assessments, self and external third-party assessments, are in all applicable contracts and all applicable solicitation periods. So it is not, the important part is not to pay attention to what DoD estimates the phased rollout will be. It is much more important to pay attention to what your prime customer is planning on doing and what the prime customer's policy is going to be, and realizing that the level of DoD discretion and that level 2 lock-in phenomenon that can happen if the prime requires an external assessment will dictate your particular schedule much, much more than the estimated rollout, which when you dig into the details is kind of notional, right? There is no like hard line where they're like, the policy is not, we will not have C3PAO third-party assessments until 2026. The policy is, it is our discretion when we will have those C3PAO assessments until 2026, which is a very different situation than I think people are convincing themselves of.
Yeah, and I think it's also saying that we will not require you to have those until 2027, right? We're not going to check and make sure that you're doing it, but you still have to do it. The widely overlooked thing here, Jacob, is that, again, I mentioned it earlier, these are deadlines, but these are deadlines for prime contractors. Mm-hmm. As a prime contractor, you're not going to wait until 2027 and be like, okay, now it's time for my level 3 certification. Let me get this all in order. Oh no, I have this supply chain of subcontractors, tertiary contractors that goes 30 deep. Now we got to get them in order so that we can get this contract. That's not how it's going to work. Exactly. Leading up to it, as they're getting ready, you're going to be put on as a subcontractor and a tertiary contractor to a prime. You're going to be put on the spot before any of these phase timelines come across.
Yep, absolutely. So let's just talk about some of the rationale that they provide in the 32 CFR rule. Why have a phased rollout? So assuming by the time we are having this conversation, since it's the holidays and things like that, that the FAR CUI rule is around, the FAR CUI rule, we don't anticipate will have a phased rollout. Right? Phased rollout is a DoD thing that they have decided to do to make the ramp up for assessment capacity and the implementation timeline for contractors more smooth, right? They don't have to do that. They could just slam it into contracts overnight and say level 1, level 2, level 3, self-assessment, external assessment, just as they come up. But they've tried to sort of grade this into some sort of an on-ramp, more or less. But why are they doing that? So they say in the rule, DoD considered many alternatives before deciding upon the current CMMC implementation plan. The phased implementation plan is based on CMMC assessment level and type, which DoD believes to be a fair approach for all prospective offerers. Defining the phase-in period on contract type, company size standards, or other potential bases could lead to unfair advantages. So in DoD's mind, this is the most fair way to structure the phased rollout over time, both for people to implement the requirements and for them to ramp up assessment capacity. If they based it off of anything else, it would create unfair advantages or disadvantages based on your company size, the type of work that you do, so on and so forth.
Do you think that the delay in the level 3 implementations being required in contracts, do you think that that's at all associated with the fact that level 3 is the first time that introduction of new implementation costs is taking place?
Yeah, probably. So,
Because I mean, they're substantial too. It's like SOC, you know what I
oh
mean?
yeah,
It's like, yeah, so it's IR as a service. So like, I could see just with that overhead that comes with it, like that being the logic behind pushing those out. I was like, because when we were looking at the phase rollout and saw that 2027, that's when level 3 came in. I was like, that's really important stuff for us not to be checking in on it. If that's the high priority, high value assets, why not? And then I could see why. Like the
yeah,
first time in the CMMC spectrum that the implementations actually are costing,
yeah, absolutely. So another note here that comes up, it came up in the public comments on the rule. We hear this from time to time. So the important thing to know is that these phases are cumulative, right?
Mhm.
They don't replace one another. So as they say in the rule, requirements from earlier phases continue as each additional phase is implemented. So it isn't that it's only self-assessments in phase 1 and then we get to phase 2 and there are no more self-assessments. It's that anything that would qualify for a self-assessment gets a self-assessment. Anything that would qualify for a level 2 C3PAO assessment gets a level 2 C3PAO assessment, and on and on and on. By the time you get to phase 4, which is the permanent phase, if you will, because CMMC will be fully implemented at all levels, all statuses at that point. Some people might have level 1 self-assessment. A very small number of companies might have level 2 self-assessment. Most people handling CUI will have level 2 C3PO assessment, on and on and on. Okay, so let's talk about this issue that also comes up, a point of confusion. It's a 4-phase, 4-year phased rollout, but they're talking about it over the course of 7 years. So which one is it? Is it a 4-year rollout or is it a 7-year rollout? And the answer is it's both. It's actually both. So DoD is phasing in the CMMC levels and types of assessments over the course of 4 years of these 4 phases, but it will take 7 years in total, according to DoD estimates, for all DoD contracts to wrap up and for all new contracts to be issued with the corresponding requirement. You can see the difference if you compare Table 5 in the rule with Table 8 in the rule, which is the number of total entities over the phase-in period. And you can see that they just repeat the same 16,000-ish companies per year for level 2 certification assessments once you get to phase 4, full implementation, because there will still be people by the time you get to 2028 who haven't gotten a new contract yet that won't have had that requirement. It'll take, they think, 7 years for all of the DoD contracts in the book of business, if you will, to turn over to new contracts that now require some level of CMMC certification. So that's why you hear the 4-year phased rollout or the 7-year rollout. They're really talking about the same thing from 2 different perspectives.
So it's just so I'm understanding correctly, it's with anticipation that there are contracts that are existent with option years or whatever it may be, and the expiration date of those contracts exceeds what the rollout period of the initial CMMC program would be.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
you can't in the middle of an existing contract in the option year be like, oh, hey, here's this clause, let me throw it in
Yeah.
there, right?
They're not going to retroactively go back
Yep.
and change existing contract agreements to say, hey, you got to go get CMMC. They're just going to wait for those to age off. And then when you go up to bid on a new contract, then it will have CMMC requirements in it. And they anticipate that'll take about 7 years for that to occur. So we get to full implementation by phase 4, but there's going to be another 2 or 3 years before everybody is on a new solicitation. So that's why you hear the difference between 4 and 7. So same pattern that we've talked about in the past, right? What you hear about in the phased rollout is not the primary thing that you should be orienting yourself to, because especially now that we're several weeks, a month or more past the final rule, we're starting to hear the primes talk about what their phased rollout plan is, phased rollout, if you will, meaning when we bid on a DoD contract, we need you, the supply chain, to be ready to go. So it doesn't really matter what you think the phased rollout is. This is what we need you to do. So as you said, just the rule of thumb to keep in mind, if you're a subcontractor, which most people in the DIB are, when you read DoD policy about how they're going to roll this policy out in contracts, they aren't necessarily talking to you. They're talking to your customer. So you need to have that close relationship with your customer in order to determine what your strategic decision is going to be, because you don't have until Q2 of 2028. You don't have until Q2 of 2027. You really don't even have until Q2 of 2025 because of the level of DoD discretion, the level of prime discretion, CMMC level 2 lock-in as a result of the policy that's explained in the rule. So pay attention to the phased rollout. It's an interesting thing to know, but it is not a black and white absolute, it will occur at this day on this time for my specific company.
Yeah, I feel like that there's going to be a lot of presents after Christmas that have to deal with that come from the prime contractors that have to deal with getting your house in order. I don't know. I'm not a gambling man, but if I were.
Yeah. Well, and coming up soon, we're going to have some folks from the C3PAO community on the podcast to talk about what they're seeing, what their schedule looks like, how people are preparing, how long the backlog is to get their assessments rolling. So subscribe, be sure to tune in, and that's going to be a really good one. So let us know what you think, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.